My name is James Coffey, and I'm here to give a presentation today about cross-cultural conflict resolution. This topic interested me a lot because in my time here at USD, I've spent a lot of time discussing American culture, particularly how it affects business. So I was very interested in seeing how different nations, different cultures conduct business, as well as how they handle conflict resolution. I found a lot of interesting information, and I'm very excited to share it with you today. So first things first, I'm going to start by introducing why cross-cultural conflict resolution is so important. Then I'm going to dive into some of the challenges that are involved in conducting a multicultural workplace. I'm going to talk about how some of these cultural influences can actually impact styles of conflict resolution. I'm going to discuss a method that can effectively resolve conflicts between different cultures. And lastly, I'll have a slide with some of my concluding thoughts. Now, why is cross-culture conflict resolution so important? First, we are an increasingly global economy. Trade between nations and cultures continues to grow. Even if you're a domestic business, it's important that you understand some of these cultural differences. For example, you might have foreign suppliers, distributors, customers. So it's important to know how these different cultures are going to react to certain cultural norms. Also, some of these business norms vary greatly by culture. Some of the aspects that vary include power distance, structure, individualism, and collectivism, as well as some demographical factors, all of which that I'll be touching on later. And it's also important that understanding differences can lead to greater organizational cohesion, especially in a multinational organization. Understanding some of the differences between cultures can lead to greater success and team cohesion. Now, multicultural workplaces can have a lot of benefits. They can provide new perspectives and increased skills in different areas. However, there are also a lot of challenges that come along with it. For example, there can be a lot of psychological distress that comes with the cultural heterogeneity of multinational teams. For example, it's found that culturally homogenous groups, such as those who come from the same culture, same background, experience less psychological distress than those with cultural heterogeneity. And this can be not ideal because this can lead to less cohesion. It can take longer for groups to norm in this scenario. There's also some language barriers that can present themselves. And it's important to understand that these aren't always solved by simply just adding more translators. For example, there's different dialects, local expressions, regional differences, as well as various culture-specific references that might not be caught by a simple translation of the language. So it's very important that these barriers are met and addressed. Also, there's a lot of nonverbal differences that vary between cultures. As we've learned about in class, nonverbal communication is extremely important. It accounts for about 80% of our communicated message. One example I have on this is that eye contact in Western cultures can be seen as a sign of trust and respect. However, it might be considered rude and even offensive in some Asian cultures. Another important aspect of some of the challenges related to multicultural workplaces includes some of Hofstede's dimensions of culture. In particular, the one I want to touch upon is low context versus high context cultures. Dr. Rahul Kushwaha found that when examining German businessmen, he tends to rely more on the actual spoken word, the content of the message. That's an example of a low context culture. However, a Japanese businessman is going to rely more on nonverbal cues and implicit understanding to take away the meaning of that message. So, for example, if these two gentlemen were to interact, they might have a difference in meaning, leading to a miscommunication. So, now, these cultural differences can play a huge impact on the conflict resolution of that particular culture. One of the key ones is individualism versus collectivism and how that varies by culture. For example, as Americans, we're highly individual, perhaps the most highly individual culture in the nation, especially in business, in the world, particularly in business. This is where we are found to compromise or compete instead of accommodate in terms of a conflict resolution style. However, Asian countries, which are typically more collectivist, tend to maintain group harmony, and they may even sacrifice some of their personal interests to achieve it. Another important aspect is power distance. It's found that in African countries, particularly Nigeria, they tend to value their elders and their superiors, their managers. So because of this, they're okay with a unequal distribution of power from employees to managers. That's essentially what power distance is the scale of how comfortable a employee is with a unequal distribution of power. Another cultural difference that can impact conflict resolution is a high structure versus a low structure culture. Cultures with in place structures and procedures to deal with conflict are typically going to have an easier time solving said conflicts. However, more informal groups, those with a low structure, they're going to have a more difficult time handling those interpersonal conflicts. And going back to power distance for just a second, those cultures that are found to have a high power distance are typically going to rely more on the judgment passed down from the top. They're going to respect that decision more, and that's how those conflicts are going to be resolved. So, how do we achieve effective cross-cultural conflict resolution? Because as we've seen, there's a lot of cultural differences, and it seems like it can be very hard to bridge the gap in some of these scenarios. Two important skills are quintessential for managers and mediators to have when dealing with some of these conflicts. These include confusion acceptance and emotional intelligence, particularly empathy. Confusion acceptance refers to simply the concept that those dealing with a new culture, perhaps one's not familiar with it, are simply going to not understand a few things. They're not going to be entirely familiar with the culture as you are going to be with your own. So an effective manager is going to be patient, is going to allow time for this other participant to acclimate a little bit to the culture, and is going to be more understanding in that regard. Empathy is also a very important skill for a good cross-cultural mediator to have. This is going to allow them to better understand what the other party is going through. In fact, Dr. S. Bonetti found that while studying Italian negotiators versus U.S. negotiators who have very different approaches to the level of emotional intelligence they display, high economic success can only be found when emotional intelligence is high for both parties. So that doesn't mean you necessarily have to display the same level of emotions, but you do have to be aware of the other party, and given that, you will achieve a lot of success. Balbir Saini and Sweta Banerjee, both researchers at Siri Balahi University, studied or made a research paper in 2024 coming up with this 6-step process to effectively deal with cross-cultural conflicts. And let's see, the first point of their system is to acknowledge conflict and set goals. This involves recognizing the conflict, preparing for a discussion of the conflict, and inviting open communication to all those affected by said conflict. The second point here is to share perspectives. This is where they're going to encourage the team to share their views, acknowledge both the positive and the negative contributions that led to this conflict, and clarify similar and different perspectives on said conflict. Number 3 is to build understanding. This is where they will identify and clarify some of the issues. They will find a common ground on what they agree upon in this conflict. They will determine the intent and the impact of participants that led to this, as well as, and it's very important in this step to avoid bias as well as judgment. The fourth step here is to agree on a solution. This is where they assess the feasibility of various solution options, address concerns, and make sure that the proposed solution aligns with the values of the team. Number 5 is to take action. This is where they'll develop a joint action plan, responsibilities, and a timeline for implementing the discussed solution in step 4. And number 6, if necessary, is to reassess and revise the solution as it's implemented. This includes assessing the effectiveness of it, listening to feedback given on the solution, addressing minor concerns before they devolve into big ones, and overall just checking to make sure that this solution has effectively smoothed over some of those cross-cultural differences. My concluding thoughts is conflicts in the workplace can be multifaceted, difficult, often confusing, and these problems are only accentuated in dealing with cultural differences. Cultures can differ in terms of language, nonverbal communication, organizational frameworks, and various other aspects, and these cultural differences can directly lead into different conflict resolution styles. These are informed by power distance, hierarchical structures, as well as individualism and collectivism. However, with all of these differences, it's crucial for managers and mediators to not only be accepting of confusion, as well as very empathetic and emotionally intelligent when dealing with some of these conflicts, but ultimately they can find success dealing with some of these differences by acknowledging conflicts, setting goals, sharing perspectives, building understanding, agreeing on a solution, taking action, and reassessing and revising this solution as it goes along. That is all that I have for this presentation. These are my references. Thank you for your time, and